Chapter 7, Jungle Housekeeping. Missionary life in my mind's eye before I went to Ecuador comprised green jungle, thatch-roofed houses, and Indians. San Miguel fit the picture well, but what I had not seen in my imagination was what would be involved in putting those elements into some kind of working relationship. What was involved, I found, took up about 9/10 of our time. There was the matter of water. Our supply was a small river at least 300 yards away, across the plaza and down a steep, usually muddy bank. People swam, bathed, washed clothes, watered their animals, and washed their chamber pots in this river. Most of them, I think, used it as a latrine as well. We were told that the latrine part was customarily downriver, and we counted heavily on that. Edelina, the teenage daughter of one of the Christian men in the assembly, worked for us a few hours every day. She saved us most of the labor by lugging the water from the river, but it was surprising how much time we spent in dipping water from buckets, carrying it in pitchers or pots or basins to wherever we needed it, and then in lugging the slop water to the back porch, from which we flung it out into the yard. Faucets and drains, of which we had none, began to seem like miracles of ingenuity. I had survived living in an Ecuadorian home in Quito, where the drinking water was never boiled, although, according to other missionaries, typhoid germs just pour out of the faucets. When the kitchen was being remodeled, I had even survived eating from dishes washed in a duck pond that had ducks still swimming merrily in it. Given the latrine situation in San Miguel, however, I went along with the general missionary consensus that drinking water ought to be boiled. The books on tropical survival said for 20 minutes at least. This turned out to be much too much trouble. Keeping the fire and the fogon going was a demanding exercise at best, and to light a gasoline pressure stove just to boil water was an expensive nuisance. We ended up bringing it to a boil, allowing the sediment to settle, and hoping for the best. Sometimes we collected rainwater from the thatched roof, but that had a funny color and an even funnier taste, probably because it was full of penicillin and other gratuitous nourishment. We had to boil milk, too, which anyone who had tried it knows is a good deal more trouble than boiling water. It has a way of doing nothing for a long time, and the minute you turn your back, it swells over the top, down over the sides of the pot, and extinguishes the fire. The sudden cessation of the pressure, stove's roar, the nauseating odor, and the quiet dripping that let us know the milk had boiled over were an almost daily occurrence. We salvaged what was left, plucked out the ribbons of skin that had formed on top, covered it to keep the flies out, and then tried to decide whether it was worth drinking since there was no way to get it cold. Then there were the simple little things that, for safety's sake, one ought not to overlook. They only take a minute, like washing lettuce. Avoid raw vegetables is good advice for a tourist, but if you're going to live in a place, it was living we were aiming for, not mere tropical survival, you want raw vegetables sometimes. The book said to dip everything, lettuce included, in boiling water for a few seconds. This could be counted on usually to kill amoeba and always to kill one's zest for salad. We tried what another book suggested: soak lettuce in water, boiled cooled water it had to be, and there went another precious quart, with a few drops of pomegranate added. Yet other books declared that this treatment would do nothing to hurt either ourselves or the germs, but we kept up the practice most of the time as it made us feel we were doing something. Unpasteurized butter occasionally came by horseback from Santo Domingo. This, too, we were told must be boiled. Here we drew the line. Some risks obviously had to be taken. We kept it submerged in a jar of salt water to keep it from spoiling, and it lasted a week or more. When it was gone, we used jam on our bread, jam which we had to make. We concocted sweets out of whatever we could find. When there were oranges, we bought 100 for 30 cents. Sometimes we made jam of apple peelings and cores or green papayas. There was no such thing as prepared foods. We never just opened a can of something for supper. Each meal had to be planned and prepared, especially taking into account the tastes of our school teacher Marta, who had been accustomed to 2 full-course meals a day besides breakfast. We ate whatever we had, often the same menu twice in a day, in order to use up leftovers immediately. We had no refrigerator to store them in. One of the great joys was pineapple. Sometimes there were none at all, but often there were huge quantities of them, big and sweet and running with juice, and we could buy them for 3 or 4 cents apiece. Rice, eggs, beans, and bananas were the foods we could count on all the time. One day I heard that they would be killing a pig the next morning. It did not at first occur to me that this was an event at which I had better be present. It meant meat, and if I wanted to buy some, I had better be there when the animal was killed. The whole population of San Miguel was alerted at 6 o'clock by the hideous shrieks and squeals of the doomed creature, and we hurried to the spot with plates, pots, and money in hand. The flaying and cutting up was done with amazing speed, and soon a huge vat of lard was bubbling and popping over an open fire, and people were throwing in pieces of plantain and manioc to deep fry. There were cracklings as well, and I bought a handful of these in a newspaper package. I carried home a pale gray chunk of pork, unidentifiable as to its cut, and stuck about with bristles for which I had paid 15 cents a pound. We had a wonderful breakfast that morning of fried pork, cracklings, roasted plantains, and coffee, a pleasant change from oatmeal and boiled milk. Bread making was another major project. It was hard to get flour in San Miguel. It was harder to keep it from becoming moldy or weevil infested. It was hard to get yeast and keep it fresh. It was quite a task to mix and knead on the narrow board we had for a counter, but the worst difficulty was the oven. The small, round aluminum contraption fit over the top of the pressure stove. It held only a single loaf, a round one, and the first few times I made the loaf too big so that it rose and lifted the top off the oven, cooling the oven and spilling down over the sides of the pan. In time we learned to make the loaves the proper size, but there was no putting the bread in the oven and forgetting about it for an hour. One of us had to hover over it continually, trying to keep the temperamental pressure stove from burning the bread to a cinder or from fizzling out altogether. We also had a pressure cooker. It seemed a godsend at first, but you had to have a stove that fit with it. Our stove did not. Our sanctification was rigorously tried as we sought to tenderize our meat or beans in this civilized pot. It worked for a while, but one day, the stove being too hot for it, it blew its safety valve right through the thatched roof. It was lost forever, so the Lord delivered us from that temptation. Wood was another thing. It was sometimes green, sometimes rain-soaked as well. We never seemed to get ahead enough to dry it properly, for this would have taken months or even years in so humid of a climate. We were forever nursing reluctant fires that sizzled and hissed. The sound of Adelina's fan seemed to go most of the day, and cooking was always a very smoky and slow business. Adelina washed our clothes in a tub with an old-fashioned scrub board, which was quite new-fashioned to her, who had been used to pounding clothes on the rocks in the river. She fetched buckets of water, heated it in the tub by building a fire underneath, and used detergent that we were able to buy in Santo Domingo, or lacking that, bars of blue soap 15 inches long, which she cut into manageable cakes. The clothes were hung on a line in the yard or under the back porch, but rarely dried in a single day because of the heavy mist and relatively short intervals of sunlight. Dorothy or I would usually have to bring them in the late afternoon, drape them about the furniture, and carry them out again the next morning. Then there was ironing. We had a gasoline pressure iron, which was as infuriating as the pressure cooker and the pressure stove. It was always getting clogged. It had to be prodded with a special pin, whereupon it would roar and pop with flames for a few minutes, just as you got nicely started on a blouse, and then die ignominiously as you were about to finish collar and cuffs. By the time you reamed it, filled it, primed, and pumped it again, the collar and cuffs had dried. You might get a garment beautifully ironed once in a while, hang it up with satisfaction and pride, and find that after a wet jungle night it had unironed itself. We began to understand how Doreen and Barbara had come to terms with wrinkles. None of us felt sorry for ourselves for having to cope with inconveniences. Inconvenience belonged to missionary life. The proportion of time, however, that was consumed with these temporal matters bothered me. When I was fiddling with the stove, I felt that I ought to be working on the language, the real work I had come for. But what perversity of my nature was it that made me put off the language work, even when the dishes were being done by Adelina, the clothes were hung on the line, and the bread had been baked? I would hie myself over to the study and sharpen pencils. I would find that the desk was littered with scorched bugs from the lamp the night before and would have to set about a major cleaning operation. I would rearrange file cards and dash off a few letters I wanted to have ready in case someone offered to carry mail to Santo Domingo. As soon as I get this stuff out of the way, I can settle into the task, I told myself. It was a monumental struggle every day for me to get at the brain work instead of dawdling with physical work. The awful truth was that I really preferred the housekeeping. I loved order and neatness and organization, but I did not like to concentrate. After an hour or two of sheer effort of willpower to stick at the job, I was relieved when I had to go back to the house and check Adelina's progress with the lunch. I, the Lord, have called thee. These words were always in the back of my mind. I was sure they were true. The reduction of the Colorado language was a divinely appointed task, and I must do it.